Peter, in 2021, we launched our 10-year strategy. I was just wondering if you'd like to tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, it was a very carefully and thoroughly researched strategy where we listened to lots of people inside the organisation and outside the organisation about where and how they thought the NSPCC could make its most distinct contribution. So we researched not only what we had done and what had been successful in the past and what our strengths were, but also what other people were capable of doing, so that true to the kind of fundamental philosophy of the NSPCC down the ages, we could say we are walking towards the children and young people who need us most, and that we are enabling and we are influencing those things which, say, the NSPCC is best placed to deliver. That can be quite uncomfortable because whilst building on our strengths and being determined to do that, and absolutely respecting where we have come from and how we've got to the position we're at, what you've done great in the past isn't necessarily what you most need to do out into the future. If that were true, we would still be walking around in our inspectors' uniforms. So it was a significant shift, and this was talked about right up to and including the board, more towards prevention and earlier intervention, which meant that we stopped doing some direct services, not because those direct services weren't needed, but that if they were only helping the small number of children that we were able to touch, there was something random about that. But also it was letting the statutory services off the hook for what their obligations and responsibilities could be. And all the numbers were telling us that if we don't have some people getting engaged and involved earlier, everything is just progressively getting worse, and you're rescuing ever smaller numbers of children ever later in the day as the issues and challenges get more and more complex. So we're still engaged and interested in that space, and the lighthouse in London is a great kind of transformative illustration of how we think it's possible to design and deliver one-stop services for children who've experienced sexual abuse much more effectively than is typically done across the country. The work we do in Blackpool is transformational in terms of looking across a place at how we can make a difference. But that was the sort of fundamental shift. And then we wanted a small number of memorable things which we could all get behind and be confident that the NSPCC itself could make a palpable difference in over a 10-year period. So I think people are pretty familiar with our 3 impact goals. One is that everyone can play a part in keeping children safe. The second one is that the online world should be as safe as the offline world. And the third is that children should be able to speak up and be understood if they have a worry or a concern. And there's lots of things that we've done and that since 2021 that have increasingly been brigaded around trying to make an impact on one or more of those things. Probably in the last couple of years, the second impact has received the most public attention. So the NSPCC, we were very early to call for statutory regulation of the tech companies. And I remember being in a meeting with the ministers at the time. The Secretary of State was Matt Hancock, if you remember him.
Yes.
And Margot James was his junior minister, and saying to, I can't remember, it was something like, we'd already had 13 self-regulatory codes which the industry had signed up to. So I remember saying to them, what is it that makes you think the 14th self-regulatory code is going to make a difference? And you could see some sort of pennies dropping, and from there it was then, having established the principle, with a Conservative government that the internet should be regulated, which is no mean feat, to work through the detail of how that was going to take place. And that was painful, detailed, challenging work where we had fabulous staff working on it here. We had great legal support from pro bono companies around us, because we had to show that it is possible to regulate the internet in this way. It is possible to create a legally enforceable duty of care on the companies. We set out 6 tests that were absolutely transparent of what we needed to see from regulation. Because if I go back to my time as a civil servant, it's really easy to pass laws, but they can be hopeless. So, of the 6 tests, when the government published its first bill, 1.5 of the tests were met. So we had to, having established the case through our Wild West Web campaign, we then had to engage at the next level of detail down to get as many of these tests passed as possible. And there was then, as people will know, a painful process through the House of Lords, the House of Commons, changes of prime ministers, changes, anything that you could imagine that could have got in the way, did get in the way, but we were relentless in bringing people back to the essence of child protection must be designed into the online world as it is in the offline world, because that's where children, young people are increasingly living their lives, and they don't see the distinction. And young people are saying to us, we want to enjoy the benefits of online lives, but at the moment, as soon as we go online, we are at risk of being abused by readily preventable adjustments that could be made to the people who are designing and developing these services, and are absolutely clear that there are vulnerable children on their platforms. At the end of the legislative process, and we wouldn't have written the Act the way it ended up, 5 of the 6 tests were met. So that is a huge tribute to the campaigning work of the NSPCC and others around us, and a great tribute, say, to the painstaking policy thinking that had gone on behind that. So kind of big tick in the box. Never quite satisfied. The one test which wasn't met by the Act was our call for a child advocacy body written into the law. So in some other regulatory arrangements, take the Post Office for example, there's a consumer voice body which is funded by a levy on the industry, and it's their job to articulate on a regular basis what the service is actually like. So we would have loved to have seen a kind of capability for young people to be sharing all the time what's happening to them, irrespective of what the companies might say should be happening or the regulator might be finding. We may have another go at that if there's another piece of legislation. In the meantime, of course, we've got Childline all the time, taking calls and contacts from young people, telling us what they're experiencing online. We are noisy with anyone who will listen to us and many who won't, about how this is a missing piece of the jigsaw and how children and young people deserve a voice. They're no less important than customers of the Post Office. In fact, they're very much more important. So that's a bit of unfinished business. And no doubt, as Ofcom moves forward, we will want to encourage them to get on with enforcing the legislation that is in place, so that the companies can see that this has teeth. But already we are seeing adjustments being made by the companies that are taking account of better differentiated experiences for young people, and making presentations lauding what magnificent changes they are making in response to what their consumers and the public want. And a bit of me thinks that's wonderful, and a bit of me thinks there is no way you'd have done that without the legislation, and there's no way the legislation would have happened without NSPCC campaigners and NSPCC policy and public affairs folk and comms experts and pro bono advice and support from kindred spirits, out there, who knew what needed to be done. So yeah, really important development and achievement about halfway through our strategy.